Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Adam Marblestone. He's the CEO of Convergent Research, an incubator in the Schmidt Futures Network that identifies high-impact scientific or technical research and development opportunities and launches these projects as focused research organizations. Adam is going to tell us about the FRO model, a new type of special purpose organization created solely to solve scientific or technical challenges that cannot be efficiently addressed by the existing organizational structures of academia, industry, or government. Take it away, Adam.
Thank you so much for having me. I will be talking about focused research organizations. And what I really want to capture in this talk, rather than just my usual description about this particular model and some of the problems that we're working on, is to try to explain and point this group at the question of how to sort of extend and make real this recent tweet by Michael Nielsen, where Michael said, this act of creating focused research organizations allows us to act as market makers, matching projects and funders. And sort of the TLDR is that in addition to simply having a model that we think fits certain projects that couldn't happen otherwise and gets a certain amount of science done, we think that by working on this and by ideally kind of building a whole ecosystem around this, which is where I think this audience and this group would be really interesting to discuss, we can actually elicit projects and teams that not only couldn't they get funded, but we wouldn't even have been able to generate the ideas in the first place and have the teams form in the first place. So I think the big question is how can we do that rather than just how can we fund some finite bundle of projects in a particular way. But let me start by explaining what we mean by the focused research organizations and a bit about how we came to this. So my background is in biology and neuroscience in many ways, and this is a photo from the Society for Neuroscience annual meeting every year, which has about 30,000 neuroscientists that show up for it. And what you'll notice about that is that basically there's a kind of a one-to-one mapping between projects, which are these posters that are being described by the scientists, and the scientists themselves. So the unit of work is really the individual scientists, or maybe two or three collaborating, getting first or co-first authorship on one of these scientific posters, which will eventually be a paper. And Christoph Koch, who at some point became chief scientist of the Allen Institute for Brain Science, which was also noticing this problem, referred to this as a sociological Big Bang. So the way that the academic world of biology and neuroscience is structured is towards diversification and kind of all flowers bloom, many different directions blooming, and many different individual career paths and ideas blooming. But there are many problems within research or within the broader sphere of research that end up being bottlenecking or rate limiting for progress in research that don't work well with that model of sort of each individual person making their own discoveries and writing their own papers, and where you need a model that looks more like the kinds of internal organization that a startup has. So many fields of science are bottlenecked more by engineering or by teamwork or team science that requires a more tight-knit management and sort of systematic logistics and organization internal to the firm, if you will, versus the situation where even in very well-funded academic labs, the unit of work is still, one or two or three people trying to write a particular paper, because that's how credit assignment works. So, there are these problems often involving development of tools or platforms that would accelerate research, sometimes data sets, but it can be quite general, where we think there's a need for more systems engineering. And this idea was also brought out and commented on in the context of DeepMind's recent major advances in protein folding research, where the way that they accomplished that where these, in general, they have lots of different types of organization going on and different researchers doing different things. But for a project like the AlphaFold project, they had this sort of what was referred to as a fast and focused model by this professor Mohammed Al-Karishi. And so what Mohammed Al-Karishi pointed out, even about the AlphaFold paper, is that it has 18 co-first authors. And he says this is reflective of an incentive structure wholly foreign to academia. Everyone is rowing in the same direction. So that's sort of the idea of what a focused research organization is meant to enable in more fields. Now, also, I think there are certain fields that have adapted to develop these types of models more than others. So fields that had a strong involvement in World War II and in the Cold War and aerospace and physics, and also that are just more mature in many ways and have been around for longer than something like neuroscience or other areas like climate or biosecurity. These areas, of course, have done things like the Hubble Space Telescope or CERN or so on. But how can we generalize that across other areas of research? So this focused research organization model is just that. Sometimes we refer to it as nonprofit startups, although I think that's a bit of an oversimplification. But the key criteria, it has to be focused research, and it has to have the ability to organize itself as an organization to optimize to solve that problem internally in a way that isn't structured, according to the incentives of academia. So focused, often this is not necessarily the best model for kind of very, very open-ended or undefined areas of research. There are many other bottlenecks there where other kinds of new research organizations are needed for more open-ended problems. But in order to get people to make the jump and say, we're going to do this focused research organization on topic X, and to get funders to commit to that, the ones that we've been working on so far have been much more specific and quantifiable milestones, concerted sort of singular effort, not something that could be easily distributed across many different groups. They are research, though. We're not just thinking of these as straight build-outs or deployments. They can be engineering heavy, but they can have key components of technical risk. And often, for this model to be justified as opposed to a startup or kind of small business type model, in the traditional VC-backed way, let's say for a startup, you actually want it to be, in the earlier stage of research, then you would be ready to directly make a product and generate significant returns within a short time. And the idea of it being an organization, so an independent or semi-independent leadership directing not only what are the scientific problems that are being worked on, but also how is it organized internally in terms of the structure, in terms of the staff, who you hire, and what those people's incentives are, who they report to, in a way that is much more customized than you would have in the academic progression. These are often relatively small teams, maybe between 10 and 30 people so far, but they're above a certain critical mass where it makes sense to have your own organization. So again, these are problems that can't be done in academia. Almost any problem that we want to push on as a research funder, if it can be done as an academic project or if it can be done as a startup, those are very robust mechanisms, and so we would want to do it that way. But these are problems where we're specifically looking for the ones that couldn't be done that way. Maybe you need to hire professional engineers from industry, or surgeons, or project managers, or things like that, technicians that wouldn't fit into the academic system, problems that might have a low citation per dollar, low number of papers per dollar, key data sets. In many cases, they'll be public goods, again, the commons, like a core data set or underlying scientific tooling. It's not necessarily that there wouldn't be, spin-off companies, or there wouldn't be things ultimately that would be bought, but they would not fit well into a VC portfolio in terms of, capturable value. And then, we want to only focus the attention of philanthropists on these for the most high impact and most important problems, which can be defined in many ways. It could be that the government picks these up as big science projects. It could be that they spin off companies that then have a lot of impact, or it could be this more organic techniques or tools or data sets that become ubiquitously used by a scientific field. So what about some of the other existing organizational structures that we have for this? Well, there are things like national labs, there are big existing institutes that can organize differently. And sometimes they do FRO like projects. Like, Janelia, HHMI's Janelia Farm Research Campus, for example, has done work on mapping the connectome, brain connectome of a fly brain, which I think is a very FRO-like model that they spun up internally. But the question is, how do you generalize that, right? So if you don't run Janelia or the Allen Institute, or you're not in charge of the congressional oversight of the budget for a national lab or things like that, how do you actually spin up a project as a repeatable model outside of this institution, where whoever has the best ideas would just be able to create that? Similarly, DARPA is also, I think, a related kind of reference class and very powerful and important. And we also need sort of privatized ARPA-like entities in addition to FROs. But DARPA is still its magic, and its strength is that it is coordinating distributed groups at existing organizations. So the magic is you can rapidly spin something up without asking people to leave and form their own organization. You can rely on very widely distributed sets of contractors, add or remove funding, retool, reteam and recombine different groups at existing organizations. That's part of the power of it. But in some cases, you really do need to get a large critical mass of the project under one roof with its own leadership and its own internal sort of incentives and organizational dynamics going to actually solve a problem, as we've certainly seen in big science, areas like CERN or space telescopes or things like that. And of course, also, the idea is to also not have this just be restricted to the problems that the existing ARPA agencies have. So a couple examples. In 2021, with two different philanthropic backers and foundations, we managed to spin up 3 focused research organizations, all in areas so far related to or adjacent to biology. So we have one called E11 Bio that's based in Alameda, which is developing a faster, cheaper, better technology for mapping brain circuits, which is relevant, I think, both to sort of fundamental neuroscience, potentially AI, and a lot of biomedical applications. We have one in Boston called Cultivarium that is working on extending synthetic biology and bioengineering methods from the relatively limited set of microorganisms in which researchers mostly work into a much wider set of microorganisms or sort of hosts or chassis organisms for synthetic biology. And then we have the Astera Institute has created a focused research organization, or you can think of it as FRO-inspired project that's being done in collaboration with the Buck Institute to do a very large and comprehensive study of the whole body kind of biological effects of different anti-aging interventions, and how might you combine interventions to sort of affect the overall omic profile of the body as it relates to aging. So those are 3 projects. I think that beyond a set of specific projects, we also are very interested in creating a kind of ecosystem around this and making it much easier for any funder and any team both to come up with the ideas and proposals to form the organizations and to execute on these things, similar as a Y Combinator, safe convertible note financing documents have greatly accelerated the simplicity and speed at which people can do startups. In what we're doing, I would say there's a couple of key components. This is what's getting closer to this original question about the market making aspect. So there's the FROs themselves and some kind of common knowledge that we're trying to form and expertise that we're trying to form around how do you build FROs. But there's also the question of how do you actually define the scientific bottlenecks, problems, challenges, and opportunities that require these larger teams and require these bigger leaps. And so to do that, we practice something that various people have referred to as scientific road mapping. We think of this as sort of mapping constraints around what's possible, trying to have a very systematic way of analyzing what would be the possible projects to do in a way that's ideally quite distant from the sort of historical artifacts of what do people happen to be working on now. and also tightly shows what are these kind of nodes in this graph, dependency graph of the technology tree, if you want, where you would need to intervene with a focused research organization versus things going to happen in some sense on their own in the existing system. So we have some methods that we've sort of started to hone on this, particularly from looking at the problem of large-scale neural recording in the mouse brain, but that we're applying to various other problems. So I'll just briefly highlight a couple of ideas that sort of are coming out of this. These are in no way an advertisement of what the next FROs would be with any particular funder, but these are just ones I think that maybe illustrate for what I think some people in this audience might find interesting. We continue to be interested in a number of problems related to the brain and neuroscience, and I think that neuroscience, because of just the raw complexity and scale of the brain, continues to be an area where it will generate FRO opportunities on an ongoing basis, in contrast maybe to some more mature areas like genomics that have sort of already been through some of those transitions in terms of being more industrialized. Neuroscience is still not quite there, and I also think it's very important. So, one of the things that we're very interested in is new modalities for imaging and modulating both the brains of humans and animals, and ultrasound is one that is emerging as very interesting there. Somewhat in a related category, but not exactly the same problem, is the question of not so much how much can you modulate in the human brain and how much of the sort of field of view and control can you get in a psychologically relevant way, but if you want to go ultra deep into the microcircuitry of a particular brain area, there's a lot of systems engineering that involves things like nanophotonics and combining that with biology, methods like optogenetics, where you really need to push fabrication and nanophotonics quite a lot further than it is now in a really quite industrial grade way in order to solve that problem of using light as a sort of very high bandwidth medium for getting signals out of the brain. But then in order to do that, you have to be able to steer and shape light inside of a very complicated three-dimensional random medium that is the brain tissue, and that requires a lot of complex fabrication and photonics. And then we're also quite interested in some areas in energy and climate. Fusion energy is one that's been surprisingly fertile with FRO ideas, which I found a bit surprising, because there has been this transition recently where there are many for-profit, very well-funded fusion companies now coming out doing things that otherwise would have been done by big international projects or national labs, but because of the materials and so on, involved in making high field magnets coming down in price and various other things that have changed, and just the venture ecosystem changing, and the interest in climate changing, there are these for-profit fusion companies. But what's interesting is that each one of those is basically trying to create a particular kind of fusion reactor design that would ultimately be the product that is the fusion reactor. But there's a lot of kind of public goods that are things like measurement tools or ways of characterizing materials, test beds for different systems that come a little bit further down the line, even from when a reactor concept at its most basic physics level is proven. But in understanding something like how do you make the materials used in building the reactor robust to all the neutrons that are going to be spit out in fusion, there are underlying sort of scientific tools or instrumentation that the government has so far been somewhat slow to mobilize development of, and where we think actually, interestingly, fusion might actually be a fertile area for FROs. With all that in mind, what I want to come back to is this broader question of market making, and where does this fit in, and where does this leave the broader opportunities for sort of mechanism design and finance and how these larger systems get prioritized. And the broader backdrop is very exciting time to be living, of course, is this emergence of new philanthropic or public good generating modalities, as we're seeing in this conference. So I think the cause prioritization axis has become very exciting with things like GiveWell, OpenPhil, FTX, effective altruism, pushing in long-termist directions, or sort of thinking much more deeply about what is the actual impact and how do you optimize impact. There's work on allocation of resources. I know there's some in this talk in this workshop, about sort of combining people's expertise in order to make decisions on what you specifically fund, with sort of variations around some set of priorities. There's faster ways of making grants that are very exciting right now, and should be pushed on. And so where do FROs really fit? I mean, it's not, I think, primarily really an institutional innovation. I mean, it's more about what are the ideas and what are the teams, as it is any particular kind of legal structure for the FRO. But I think what's exciting about framing it in this way of saying what would be the critical mass problems where you need to get a team together. It can't be done in the existing structures. It goes beyond a certain scale, and it solves a sort of very concrete, very actionable set of problems. Is that by going around and trying to get those things funded, we actually end up surfacing opportunities of this class and surfacing sort of broader parts of the technology tree or technology roadmap that we need in general, by doing that. So a way of thinking about that is that, if we wanted to accelerate research in any particular direction, for example, this direction of how do you extend, neuroscience and brain circuit mapping to something on the scale of the actual brain. Often this requires these team-based or systems engineering approaches, a different kind of organization. But importantly, this is a case where without some sort of repeatable mechanism for getting funding of these projects, teams or scientists that are out there that might have ideas for these projects have no incentive to even write those ideas down, and no incentive really to talk to other people about them and try to form teams and try to understand how would they actually get this off the ground, because there's basically zero probability of it getting funded. And by the same token, if you're a philanthropist and you're going out in the world and saying, well, hey, what are all the things I could do to make an impact on biosecurity or make an impact on neuropsychiatric diseases, you don't look out at the landscape and see a lot of applications coming in of this nature, because again, these things take work and they take road mapping and they take active sort of venture creation to put these things together. And so without seeing good opportunities out there, there isn't really the incentive to take bigger leaps on the part of funders. So that's essentially the market failure that we want to solve. And I think that the ultimate end state that we want to get to collectively here is we want to have this multi-sided marketplace that's very well functioning, where any one piece of this can easily connect with the others at the same moment in space and time. Because if a funder gets interested in your roadmap 10 years later, you may have not been able to pay the bills and no longer in science and not even involved in this stuff anymore, or not ready in your life to jump. And so all of these things have to happen at the same point in space and time, and that's where a lot of a role of kind of convening and market building could be powerful. So you want these roadmapped or blueprinted opportunities mapped onto scientific bottlenecks, actionable projects. You want the execution ready teams, and you also want the playbook that makes it easier for teams to execute, or the sort of set of services that makes it easier to spin these things up. You want a set of funders that are ready to support these things and actually ideally putting out sort of request for projects type ideas that signal that coordination. And then you want all of that to be informed by a sort of analysis and prioritization in a broader way, so that this is all getting steered in a good direction. So then the proposal that I would bring forth basically to this group is a question of what would be the right way, not just to say, hey, I happen to be interested in a FRO on such and such a topic, or maybe I should start creating one and send it to Convergent Research or Astera or one of the other organizations that has created these. But can we be more deliberate about it? Can we actually figure out a way to create funds that will bring a much larger number of funders, and will also very strongly signal this kind of market making process and actually elicit from the world that these FRO directions and this process of creation of these organizations, in the way that the venture capital ecosystem has sort of strongly driven the creation of startups. So you could have funds in certain types of cause areas, if you want, that people are interested in, and in that level of the fund, even if the individual FROs were generating returns or not optimized at a financial level, the level of the overall fund and over long timescales and so on, you could potentially find ways to support a network or set of FROs around certain key topics like biosecurity or brain-computer interface. And I would also say, just as a shout out to some adjacent things, that such a fund, wouldn't have to just create FROs. It could potentially also do things like private PARPA programs that Ben Reinhardt is putting together, or other kinds of mechanisms. But they would share this idea that they wouldn't even be available as grant making opportunities in the absence of a kind of market making and venture creation attempt. So with that, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be able to chat with you, and I am available to discuss these things.